I can taste the saltiness in my mouth. I can hear the waves crashing. I can feel my toes filled with sand. I can see the community singing songs of praise on the day of my baptism. Oh, I was a reluctant baptizee. I was a preacher's kid, which says a lot in and of itself. And in the tradition I grew up in, you did not have infant baptism, so you had believer's baptism. You assented to this life of faith, and then you were baptized. But what was become common, even in that tradition, was that children younger and younger were becoming baptized. So most of the kids in our congregation became baptized around 7 or 8 years old. Well, 7 came, and 8 came, and 9 came, and the preacher's kid was not baptized. Now, around that time, my Sunday school teachers and other leaders of the church began to kind of put a little pressure on the preacher's kid. They felt like I was a bad influence on the other children, which they were probably right. But then 10 came, and 11 came, and the elders of the church now were almost in full panic mode that the son of the preacher was not coming to the waters. Oh, these years later, I can only imagine the pressure my father felt. And yet he never pressured me. He kept on reminding them that one day when I was ready, when I believed, I will be baptized. Though I was having a good time playing with the elders of the church, I was about 12, 13, when I felt a nudge to come to the waters. Oh, I have no theological explanation of that moment. I just felt called to believe. I felt a certain calling from these waters to come and become part of something. Today, I'm not going to give you an excursus on the theology of baptism, although we could do that at another time. All I'm going to say is that those waters called my name. Maybe the waters called your name. You might have been a little infant, and you might not even remember it, but we are remembering together. Or maybe you were a teenager like I was, or an adult. I don't know. The water is calling your name. And that moment of baptism, it's not just something that's quite memorable in many of our stories. It's something that's quite key to even the world's understandings of the church. I mean, how many movies, TV shows, or books do we read that talk about baptism? They want to show a church? Show a baptism. But probably one of my favorites is Delmer in Old Brother, Where Art Thou? Oh, yeah, Delmer is the convicted burglar who escapes from prison and finds himself taken by this baptismal vision in this river. And he runs to the preacher and comes out of the water. You can even hear Delmer gasping as he comes up from the air. He says, "Brothers, I've been saved. Neither God nor man have nothing on me. Come on in, boys. The water is fine." Oh, the water is indeed fine. A water that we gather around often, even in our congregation. We are blessed, actually, to have a lot of baptisms. Oh, for sure, less baptism than 3 or 4 years ago. But we have the blessing to gather around these waters, and we baptize adults, and we baptize children, and the waters move, and we're reminded week after week of who we are as a community of believers. What about this water that's calling our name? So this week I've been thinking about these waters, and there's some key things that have come to my mind. Now, I hope these things I'll share with you, this is not like the last word on baptism. This is literally like JC's musings about baptism. And my hope is that it stirs your imagination. This week, Jim and I were in a preacher's meeting where we spoke about baptism and Holy Communion. And one of the things I love that Dr. Ludi told us was that we have to be careful as leaders not to act as if we're giving you the last word on these difficult, complex theological. No, it's just to stir your imagination. So as I talk about baptism, maybe it stirs your imagination on your own musings on these waters, on being baptized. One of the first things that came to mind about being baptized is that baptism initiates us into a body, into a way of being in the world. This mystery of this grace that God gives us does something that enters us into something. It's not the end, it is merely the beginning of something. And this kind of helped me this week when I thought about a man named Paul Chappelle. He is a nonprofit leader, a peace activist, but he graduated from West Point. And he tells the story of entering West Point. He came from a very difficult background. He came from a home that struggled. He came from a situation where there was a lot of violence around him. And yet he remembers kind of struggling through all of that. And he arrives at West Point. And in the first 24 to 48 hours, everything that they did was done in order to initiate them into this new community they were a part of. And he said the little rituals and the little things that they did might not make sense to anybody else, but it made sense to those who gathered there. And the whole point was to introduce these newbies to what it meant to be a West Point student. And as the years continue, it also meant to introduce them into what it meant to be a people who led their country into war. His last year at West Point, he had a change of heart. He began to wonder what it would be like if communities around the United States began to be introduced into a different way. What if, instead of initiating people into this war making, we began to initiate into peacemaking? Oh, baptism. To be baptized is to be initiated into a community whom at its core is a proclamation that love exists in the world, that healing exists in the world, that love exists in the world, and that reconciliation and healing and new life are possible in the world. What would it look like for us to live into being baptized in that way? That grace that we encounter, that we cannot comprehend in these waters, initiates us into a deeper conversation about what it means to be human in the world. Initiation. Another word that comes to mind about baptism is incorporation. Some of the rituals in the church actually mentioned that were incorporated into the body of Christ. And so what does it look like for us to be incorporated? What is this about? I don't have to remind you that so often in our own lives we tend to turn inward. We get on our high horses and our soapboxes. We behave like we are the only people in the universe. Have you ever watched a toddler? When you're a toddler, you think the world revolves around you. You say no a lot. You say, I want to do it a lot. It's all about you. And if you don't get what you want, what happens with the toddler? They have a meltdown. I mean, full force meltdown if they don't get what they want. Their world revolves around them. Now, I wish I could tell you that I haven't had my meltdowns in my own life as an adult. I'm sure maybe some in this room have had their meltdowns as adults. But that situation explains a lot about the human condition. We tend to think that life revolves around us. Whether we want to call it selfishness or like the ancient philosophers, pride, right? Whatever that thing is, it's a core tendency in the human condition that keeps us from being in relationship to God, to each other, and to the world, and to our true selves. So what is about baptism that then transforms that? It calls us into life together. We incorporate it into this community called the church, into a community of love, into a community of forgiveness, into a community of reconciliation, into a community that is a body, no longer hyper-focused on me, but now thinking about us and life together. And it does it in an interesting way, right? It does it by celebrating each individual human being in their beauty and their eclecticness and their quirks, and yet we become a tapestry of humanity together by this gift of grace. Baptism incorporating us over and over and over again, healing us from our 3-year-old tendencies to want to do it our way, to be baptized. Another thing about baptism is that in the ancient liturgy tells us this, it's new birth. Baptism provides us new birth. Now, that word in itself is quite interesting. It comes from the Gospel according to John, where Jesus is having an encounter with Nicodemus. And Nicodemus is a teacher of the law. For all we know, he is a good religious leader, a good civic leader. He's one who follows the commandments and does everything great. And you know, a poster child for what to be like. But he meets with Jesus at night. By the way, this is a separate sermon, but I often find myself meeting Jesus at night. May we all pay closer attention to those encounters. Anyways, I digress. He meets Jesus at night, and Jesus tells him, "Oh, Nicodemus, you have all the right information. Like you were a really good student at Hebrew school. But now you need to be born again, born anew." And Nicodemus, one of the interesting phrases in all of Scripture, wait a minute, Jesus, how am I supposed to crawl into my mother's womb again? And you almost hear Jesus' exasperation with Nicodemus. Oh, Nicodemus, you need to be born by water and by the Spirit. The reality of it is, friends, is that we're always being born again and again, aren't we? The question is, what are we being born into? We're being born again and again. Life comes our way, knocking on our door. Circumstances happen in our lives that change us to the core. But what are we allowing ourselves to be born into? Bitterness? Despair? Selfishness and anger? What are we allowing ourselves to be born into? Hyper-individualism? Egotism? What are we allowing ourselves to be born? Or are we allowing ourselves to be born into fruitfulness and beauty and joy and new life? That's the question. What are we leaning on as we've been born anew by water and the Spirit for all people, all of humanity? No longer divided by all the things we love to divide ourselves around. And by the way, there's always a new set of things we're going to divide ourselves around. It's just constant in our lives. That's why when I get a little bit too soapboxy about how open and affirming I am, I have to eat a little bit of humble pie, because very quickly I too begin to limit the grace of the living God. To be baptized, it's a witness to a world in desperate need of a world that says there's no longer Jew or Greek or male or female, a world that needs to be reminded that all of creation is a manifestation of God's self in the world, a world in desperate need of a witness, of a community that's constantly saying, it's not about me, it's about us being together, a witness to a community that reconciliation is possible, that forgiveness is possible, that new life is possible, that hope is possible, a community that's constantly telling the world that you can begin again and again and again, and that there's no limit to God's grace. Baptism is ever-flowing streams. Baptism is water that never ends. Baptism is water that overflows. Baptism is grace that's available beyond our wildest imaginations. Oh, baptism. Baptism. To be baptized is indeed one of the great gifts that we have together. Oh, we don't understand it. We can't quite explain it. Oh, we cannot easily parse it. 2,000 years that the church has been struggling with it. For me, I'm just thankful for that living water that I walked into over 30 years ago. Oh, I'm thankful for the living water that was poured over my children long ago. Oh, I'm thankful for the living water that I put over the foreheads close to 20 years of ministry. Oh, I am thankful to be baptized. So people of God, the living waters are calling your name. If you're baptized, maybe this week you'll kind of think about your own baptism. Maybe take the picture that your grandmother gave you, or the baptismal certificate that you have in the Ziploc bag. Look at it and tell yourself, I'm baptized. If you've never been baptized, hey, Dr. Jim and I will love to chat with you. We can make that happen. See? To be baptized. Living waters for you, for us, for the world. Abundant grace beyond our wildest imagination.